The cries of a newborn filled the small hut, but instead of joy, a deep silence followed. The midwife placed the baby girl in her mother's arms, but Adaro recoiled, her face twisting in disappointment. "She is blind," she whispered, her voice laced with disbelief. The village celebrated new life, but Adaro felt only resentment. She had given birth to a daughter who would never see the world. But fate had a lesson waiting for her, one she would never forget. Adaro sat in silence, her fingers gripping the edge of the woven mat beneath her. The wails of her newborn daughter had softened into small, helpless whimpers, yet she felt no warmth, no connection. The midwife hovered nearby, her expression filled with expectation, waiting for Adaro to cradle the child she had brought into the world. But Adaro could not. She would not. The weight of disappointment pressed heavily on her chest. She had dreamed of giving birth to a strong child, one who would run through the fields with laughter, who would grow into a beauty admired by all, who would one day bring pride to the family name. Instead, she had been given a child who would never see her own mother's face, who would stumble through life in darkness, forever dependent. The midwife hesitated before finally placing the child on a soft cloth beside Adaro. "She needs you," the woman said gently. Adaro turned her face away. Her husband, Jabari, entered the hut with anticipation in his eyes. His gaze landed on the newborn, his smile brightening as he stepped forward to lift the baby into his arms. "She is perfect," he whispered, pressing his lips to the child's forehead. Adaro clenched her jaw. She did not understand how he could say such a thing. He had not seen the midwife's worried glance, had not heard the whispers outside when the news spread. He did not know the burden they had been given. The days passed, and the village rejoiced in the arrival of new life, but Adaro could not bring herself to feel the joy that others did. She performed the duties expected of her, ensuring the child, named Nia, was fed and clothed, but nothing more. She never sang to her at night, never whispered words of love the way a mother should. She spoke only when necessary, her voice cold, detached. Jabari watched with sorrow, trying time and time again to soften his wife's heart. "She is still our daughter," he reminded her one evening, as they sat in the dim light of their home. "She is blind," Adaro replied, her voice flat. "She is also alive," he said firmly. "She breathes, she feels, she will grow. What more do you need to love her?" Adaro did not answer. She convinced herself that she was being practical. That love would only make things harder, when Nia proved to be a burden. She ignored the villagers who cast her disapproving glances, who muttered about how a mother should cherish her child no matter what. She ignored the elders who warned her that spirits watched all things, that cruelty would bring consequences. Nia grew, her tiny hands reaching for a mother who never truly embraced her. She did not understand the distance, nor the coldness, only that something was missing. When she stumbled over stones in the yard, Adaro simply sighed and turned away. When she called for her mother in the night, it was Jabari who came, offering the warmth that Adaro refused to give. The seasons changed, and still, Adaro did not soften. If anything, she became colder, resenting how Nia's presence shaped her life, how every day was a reminder of the child she had hoped for and the reality she had received. She saw the way others pitted them, how they whispered about the mother who did not love her own blood. But she did not care. Or so she told herself. One afternoon, as she sat outside weaving baskets, a shadow passed over her. The village elder, a woman whose wisdom had guided many, stood watching her. Her gaze was unreadable, but her voice carried weight when she spoke. "Child, do you think the spirits do not see?" Adaro frowned, setting aside her work. "What do you mean?" "The wind carries whispers, and the earth remembers the steps you take," the elder continued. "A mother's love is sacred. To reject it is to reject what was given by forces greater than yourself." Adaro stiffened. "I have done nothing wrong." The elder nodded slowly, as though she had expected such a response. She glanced toward the hut where Nia played, her small fingers tracing patterns in the dirt, feeling the world through touch. A mother who closes her eyes to her child's worth will one day find herself in a darkness deeper than the one she fears. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Adaro alone with her thoughts. For the first time, doubt crept into her heart. Not enough to change her, not yet, but enough to make her wonder, if the spirits truly watched, if the elders' words held truth, then what fate awaited a mother who refused to see her own child? Nia grew in the quiet corners of her home, her small hands exploring the world that she could not see. She listened intently to the sounds around her, the rustling of leaves, the laughter of other children, the gentle hum of the river in the distance. Though darkness filled her vision, her heart remained light, untouched by the cold indifference of the one who had given her life. Jabari watched in admiration, marveling at how she adapted to everything around her. She never stumbled for long, never feared the unknown. If a path was blocked, she found another way. If she fell, she picked herself up without complaint. She did not see the world, yet she understood it in ways others never could. But Adaro remained unmoved. She watched from a distance, her lips pressed into a thin line whenever she saw Jabari guiding Nia's hands across the bark of a tree, teaching her how to recognize its texture. She ignored the warmth in his voice when he spoke to her about the sky, describing the clouds she would never witness. None of it changed the truth. Nia was blind, and no amount of patience or kindness would alter that fact. One afternoon, as Adaro sat grinding maize, she overheard a group of villagers speaking near the well. "Have you noticed how the child seems to sense things before they happen?" one woman said, her voice laced with wonder. "Yes," another agreed. "Last week, she told her father it would rain before the first cloud even formed. And just yesterday, she warned the potter not to leave his work outside. Moments later, the wind knocked it over. It is as if she sees without eyes," an elder murmured. Adaro's hands tightened around the wooden pestle. She did not want to hear such things. It was nonsense. Coincidence. Nothing more. But the stories continued. People spoke of how Nia could tell when someone approached before they made a sound. How she recognized voices even after hearing them only once. How animals moved gently around her, as if they too understood that she was different. It was foolishness, Adaro told herself. Yet the whispers would not stop. Days later, Jabari entered the hut with quiet excitement in his eyes. "The elders wish to speak with Nia," he said. Adaro frowned. "Why?" "They believe she has been gifted with something beyond sight." She let out a sharp breath. "More foolishness." Jabari studied her, disappointment flickering across his face. "Is it so hard to believe that she is more than what you expected?" Adaro did not respond. She turned away, her heart pounding against her ribs. That evening, as the fire crackled in the center of their home, Nia sat beside Jabari, her tiny hands resting in her lap. Her face was serene, as if she already knew what was to come. Adaro, despite herself, watched closely. "Nia," Jabari said gently, "the elders say you can sense things before they happen. How do you do that?" The little girl tilted her head, her clouded eyes unblinking. "I just feel it," she said simply. "Like how I know when the sun is warm, even if I cannot see it." Adaro's chest tightened. Jabari smiled. "What do you feel now?" Nia was silent for a moment, as if listening to something unseen. Then, she turned her face toward Adaro. "You are afraid," she said softly. Adaro's breath caught in her throat. Jabari's gaze flickered between them. "Afraid of what, Nia?" The child hesitated, her small fingers gripping the hem of her dress. "Of me?" The fire crackled louder, filling the silence between them. Adaro's hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She wanted to deny it, to laugh at the absurdity, but she could not. Nia had spoken the truth. She feared her own daughter. Not because of what she lacked, but because of what she might be. Because she was something Adaro could not understand, something beyond reason. Because, despite all her efforts, despite the rejection, the distance, the coldness she had buried herself in, Nia had never stopped reaching for her. And Adaro did not know how to reach back. The sky darkened earlier than usual, the air thick with a scent of rain yet to fall. Adaro sat outside, her hands gripping the wooden bowl she had been using to sort grains, though her focus was elsewhere. The weight of Nia's words clung to her like a shadow. The child had spoken with such certainty, yet her voice held no accusation, only quiet understanding. It unsettled Adaro more than she cared to admit. Inside the hut, Jabari placed a protective hand on Nia's shoulder, sensing the shift in the wind. "The storm will be strong tonight," he murmured, glancing toward the sky. The villagers had already begun securing their homes, latching doors and reinforcing roofs with heavy stones. The clouds swirled above, thick and restless, as if preparing to unleash their fury. Adaro remained where she was, stubborn in her refusal to acknowledge the fear creeping into her bones. It was just a storm, the same as any other. Yet, something about the way the wind howled through the trees, how the birds had fallen silent, left an unease in the pit of her stomach. Nia shifted slightly, her unseeing eyes lifting toward the door. "Mother," she said softly, her voice carrying through the dimly lit hut. "We have to leave." Adaro stiffened, her hands tightening around the bowl. "You don't know that," she snapped, the words sharper than intended. Jabari studied his daughter carefully. "Why do you say that, Nia?" The child's small fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. "It isn't safe here," she whispered. "Something is coming." Outside, the first gust of wind sent dust spiraling through the air, rattling the thatched roof above them. Jabari wasted no time, grabbing his spear and securing the small pouch of supplies they always kept nearby. He did not question Nia's words, nor did he hesitate. Adaro, however, remained frozen. "This is nonsense," she muttered. "Running from nothing." Jabari's eyes flashed with frustration, but before he could respond, the wind howled again, louder this time, shaking the wooden frame of their home. Nia stood still, unmoving, her face unreadable. Then, she turned toward her mother once more. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Something in her tone made Adaro's pulse quicken. Then, without warning, a deafening crack split the air. The ground trembled as a massive tree, one that had stood tall for generations, came crashing down, tearing through their home with a force that sent dust and debris into the night. Adaro gasped, stumbling backward as the realization of what had just happened struck her. Had they remained inside, the weight of the falling branches would have crushed them where they stood. Her heart pounded wildly in her chest as she turned to Nia, the child standing quietly beside Jabari, her face calm despite the chaos. The storm raged around them, the wind whipping through the village as the rain finally began to fall. Adaro's breath came in shallow bursts. For the first time, she looked at Nia and truly saw her, not as a burden, not as a child born into darkness, but as something more. Something beyond her understanding. Jabari exhaled heavily, pulling Nia close. "She saved us," he murmured. Adaro swallowed hard, unable to deny the truth. The girl she had refused to love, the daughter she had tried to ignore, had just spared them from death. The storm raged through the night, tearing through fields, collapsing homes, uprooting trees. But as Adaro stood there, drenched from the downpour, watching her daughter with new eyes, she realized that the storm inside her had been far more destructive than the one outside. And for the first time since Nia's birth, she wondered if she had spent too many years walking blindly through a world she thought only her daughter could not see. The storm passed, leaving behind a village forever changed. Broken branches littered the ground, roofs had caved in, and the once sturdy walls of homes bore the scars of the wind's wrath. Yet, among the wreckage, life stirred. People emerged from their shelters, shaking off dust and debris, their eyes heavy with exhaustion but grateful for survival. Adaro stood in the middle of it all, her feet rooted to the damp earth. Her home was gone, shattered beneath the weight of the fallen tree. What should have been devastation, however, felt like something else entirely. The walls that had confined her, that had held her bitterness, were no longer there. Instead, the open skies stretched above her, vast and endless, as if daring her to see beyond the narrow world she had clung to for so long. Nia stood a short distance away, her small hands tracing the rough bark of the very tree that had nearly taken their lives. She moved with quiet certainty, her fingers reading its texture like a story only she could understand. Jabari watched her with a mixture of awe and reverence, his gratitude unspoken but deeply felt. Ataro's throat tightened as she approached. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if she carried the weight of all the years she had spent rejecting the child before her. When she stopped, Nia turned her face slightly, sensing her presence before a single word was spoken. "You knew," Ataro finally murmured. Nia's fingers paused against the bark. "I felt it," Ataro exhaled, her arms folding across her chest as she stared at the wreckage of their home. "How?" There was no hesitation in Nia's response. "The earth speaks," she said simply. "The wind, the trees, the sky. They tell me things." Ataro swallowed hard, her mind struggling to grasp the depth of what she had spent years refusing to acknowledge. It had been easier to dismiss Nia's existence, to pretend she was nothing more than a burden. But the truth had stood before her all along, waiting to be seen. Jabari stepped forward, his voice gentle. "Not all sight comes from the eyes, Ataro." The words struck deeper than she expected. Her fingers curled into her palms, her nails pressing into her skin. For so long, she had believed that Nia had been born into darkness, that she was the one trapped in a world without light. But now, standing in the ruins of all she had known, Ataro wondered if she had been the one who had lived in blindness all along. She turned to Nia, watching as the girl tilted her head slightly, listening to something only she could hear. "I never wanted you," Ataro whispered, the confession tasting bitter on her tongue. The words had lived inside her for years, festering in silence. Speaking them aloud felt like cutting into an old wound. I thought you were a curse." Nia didn't flinch. She didn't recoil. Instead, she did something Ataro had not expected. She reached forward, her small hands searching for her mother's. Ataro hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. But as Nia's fingers brushed against hers, something inside her cracked, the wall she had built beginning to crumble. "I love you anyway," Nia said softly. Ataro's vision blurred. She had denied this child, pushed her away, refused to see her worth. Yet here she was, offering love freely, without hesitation, without conditions. Ataro dropped to her knees, her hands trembling as they closed around Nia's. "Forgive me," she whispered, her voice breaking. Nia squeezed her fingers gently. "I already have." The wind moved around them, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh beginnings. For the first time in years, Ataro felt something shift inside her. Not guilt, not regret. Something lighter, something warmer. She had spent so long fearing the darkness she believed surrounded her daughter, only to realize that Nia had never been the one trapped. Ataro had been the one who could not see. And now, finally, she was ready to open her eyes. Ataro remained on her knees, her hands still wrapped around Nia's small fingers. The wind moved softly through the broken village, whispering between the trees, as if carrying the weight of all that had passed. The ground beneath her was damp from the night's storm, but for the first time in years, she did not feel cold. She had spent so long shutting out warmth, fearing that to open herself to love would be to admit she had been wrong. Now, the truth stood before her, patient and unwavering. Nia did not ask for explanations. She did not demand answers or question why it had taken her mother so long to say the words she had waited a lifetime to hear. Instead, she simply held on, her fingers steady, her presence unshaken. There was no resentment in her face, no anger in her voice. Ataro felt something deep within her break apart, not with pain, but with release. Jabari watched in silence, his expression unreadable, yet his eyes filled with something neither judgment nor reproach. He had always waited, always hoped, even when it seemed impossible. Now, the moment he had wished for had arrived, not with grand gestures or declarations, but with quiet understanding. Ataro exhaled, her breath unsteady as she slowly rose to her feet. The weight on her chest, the invisible burden she had carried for years, seemed to lift, though it did not disappear completely. Wounds of the past could not heal in an instant, but the first step had been taken. She would not turn back now. Nia tilted her head slightly, listening to the sounds around her. The village was waking, the voices of neighbors calling out to one another, assessing the damage, rebuilding what had been lost. Though destruction surrounded them, life carried on, moving forward, unbothered by what had already passed. Adaro studied her daughter. She had spent years thinking Nia would never know the world as others did, that her blindness would leave her helpless, dependent. But now, watching how she stood, unshaken in the aftermath of the storm, Adaro realized how wrong she had been. Nia was not weak. She was not broken. She had always known how to move forward. For years, Adaro had pitied her. But now, she found herself in awe. "Nia," she said quietly. The girl turned toward her mother's voice, waiting. Adaro reached out, hesitating only for a moment before brushing her fingers against Nia's cheek. "Tell me what you see." Nia smiled softly, lifting her face toward the sky. "I see the sun rising," she said. "I feel the warmth on my skin. I hear the river, still flowing. The earth is soft beneath my feet, and the wind is singing." Adaro's chest tightened. The words were simple, but they carried a depth she had never allowed herself to understand before now. Nia did not need eyes to see. She had never needed them. Adaro closed her own eyes, listening. She heard the world in a way she never had before, the rustling of the trees, the distant laughter of children, the heartbeat of the village as it carried on. It had been there all along, but she had been too blind to notice. She took a deep breath, reaching down to take Nia's hand once more. "Will you show me?" she asked softly. Nia squeezed her fingers. "Yes, Mama." The words settled deep in Adaro's heart, filling the spaces that had long been empty. As they stood together, the storm long gone, the morning light stretched across the land, bathing everything in gold. And for the first time in her life, Adaro finally understood what it meant to truly see.